Welcome to the table saw safety video, and today we're going to talk about how we use the table saw in our class. This is the table saw. This is the dust collection system set up with the table saw, and we're going to talk parts, how to use it, things you should do, things you shouldn't do, and you'll take your safety test at the end, of course. So this is called the table saw because it's simply that. You have a large table with a circular saw blade sticking out of it. And the way that we use this machine is primarily for ripping our boards, which is what you just watched. Whenever you rip a board, that is using the saw to cut along the grain. We talked about it on the radio arm saw. So cutting along the grain is ripping, and across the grain is cross-cutting. You can use this machine for cross-cutting, and we do use it. We also use it with a couple different items like push sticks, push blocks, and this, which is called a miter gauge. And the miter gauge allows you to make cross-cuts at different angles. Most of the time we'll use it for a 90 degree. Anything that we need to cut at an angle, we usually use our miter saw over there, which we'll take the safety test for that as well. You can also rotate this blade here at a different angle as well. And this blade will rotate down to 45 degrees and come back up. It only rotates down this direction. You can also see along with the table, we have our fence. We set our fence based on this roll here, and you can see it's a little bit harder to see on camera, but this line here is your distance from the fence to the left side of this blade. So the fence automatically takes into account that kerf measurement, right? Because it's measuring to this side, not the other side of the blade, right? We have our guard, and on the table saw, we can remove our guard. For some things and some projects, we will remove it. However, most of the time it will be on. We usually remove the guard for very, very thin rips, and whenever we're using our cross-cut sled, which you won't see in this video, but whenever we make larger cross-cuts or repeated cross-cuts, we'll set this up so that we can quickly do that, and we remove the guard. So this is one of the machines that you will remove the guard on. Right, so our table goes all the way to about 52 and just about 53 inches, but we have our old dust collection system, so really we can only get about 49 inches of usable space here, which if you're making a rip that big, that's a pretty large board. But we usually use that for, if we know one side is square, we can cross-cut maybe like a tabletop or something like that on this saw, right? We have our outfeed table over here, and that's where I had the camera set up. We also have, right, these push blocks, and we have these push sticks. A lot of the time, if you are making very, very thin, and I have my blade up really high, if you're making very, very thin rips, then you're gonna bring this very close to the blade. You can see, right, it is really, really close. And sometimes you won't even be able to get your push stick in to do that. But generally speaking, you want to use a push stick whenever your fence is about, I would say, 2 inches or less, or any time that you can't push your hand through next to that blade, right? So the only thing that's stopping you from putting your hand into that blade, is your brain. So you have to make sure that you're doing everything in a calculated manner. You want to make sure that everything on your table is set up and ready to go before you hit that start button. We do have a couple things to know, especially because of how high this blade is. So I left it up high so that I could do this video and you can see it. But your ideal blade height, and you will have to adjust your blade for each material that we use. The ideal blade height is going to be, and I can move this down with one hand, but it's relatively hard. So in between each of these teeth, right? So this valley where this part is, this is called the gullet of the blade. And what that's used for, so here's our teeth, right? Here's our gullet. And the gullet is for material to escape the blade, right? So, and whenever your material escapes the blade, it allows airflow to cross each tooth and reduce heat and friction. You don't want this blade to grab your material as you're using it. If you do, you're gonna get the most dangerous, I would say, kickback out of any machine in our lab. So we want to move these teeth so that the gullet of the blade is just above the material. So it's pretty much the smallest amount of blade that can be seen whenever you're cutting, right? So only the tooth is really sticking out. The less blade that you have up here, the less chance of something like an accident occurring, right? So whenever we're running this through, the only thing you're really gonna see is that tooth, and that's the gullet at the 12 o'clock position of this blade, right? So the very top of that blade, right? So what I'm gonna do is, as we are setting up this machine, I'm gonna set it up so that I am making a rip cut, and then I'm gonna set it up where I'm making a cross cut, and then, you know, I can even rotate that blade to show you how, you know, an angled rip cut would work too, right? So I'll rip it, cross cut it, and then I'll make a smaller rip as well using a push stick, all right? So once we are completely set, right, we have our power to our vacuum system over here. Looks like this. I'm gonna drop this guard over here. I'm gonna set my fence, say I wanna cut this to 4 1/4 inches, right? I would tap it over, lock the fence in place with that lever, and then I can hit the green button to turn it on. You wanna wait for that machine to spin up to full speed before you send it through the blade. You wanna keep downward pressure. You don't want your board to come up like this. You wanna keep pressure against the fence on this side. So whenever you're ready, you can push it through. Nice even motion. Just push it right on through and push it past the blade. Turn the saw off after you complete your cut before you grab your scrap. So, couple things. Number one, you have to have a jointed edge against this fence. Whatever this blade is doing is simply just mirroring what is up against the fence. So if you don't have a jointed edge against the fence, a nice square edge, you're not gonna have a nice square cut on the other side. So it's very important that you go through the proper steps before you run it through. So if you are skipping the jointer before you come here, you're not gonna have a nice square cut. It's not gonna be even where you start versus where you finish if it's not even from the beginning, okay? Next thing I wanna do is, again, make a cross cut. So I'm gonna place this miter gauge in here, and there's a nice slot. This one sticks a little bit. There's a little bit of maintenance that needs to be completed, right? You could put both guards down for this. You have to manually measure for this. Now, I don't really have a measurement. I'm just kind of making cuts. But whenever you're using the miter gauge, you have to clamp. You are using your force, your hand force, against this miter gauge, and you're sort of pushing towards the gauge itself to keep it nice and straight. Again, you have to have a jointed edge up against that miter gauge as well. And one hand on the top of the miter gauge, one hand on your board, sort of pushing down and backwards, and then with your right hand, you're gonna push forward and push it all the way through the blade. So I'll hit start, let it spin up. Push it all the way forward. You can bring this back at any time. There's a small piece over there that I have to get out, so I have to wait for that to stop spinning. Once it stops completely, I can grab it. So, some things that you never want to do when using this machine is you never want to use the fence and the miter gauge together. And the reason for that is if you push this through, you're creating pressure against the blade whenever you're holding it this way. But that blade is relieving that pressure on this side and it's pushing this board away. If you are pushing this through and you're pushing pressure against the blade from this side, you're going to push the blade to the right a little bit into this piece, causing it to pinch. Now this fence is like a hard plastic, doesn't have much resistance. You're meant to slide across it. So if you are pinching the board in between the blade and this fence, you're going to cause a kickback. So knowing where to stand in case that happens is very important. If you are making a cross cut and you're using the miter gauge, you stand on that side. So on this case, when you're using it, you stand to the left side of the blade. A kickback's not going to occur right in front of you. It would occur next to you, right? If you are ripping, you always stand along the fence here. A kickback could occur here, but you're in more control pushing it forward than you would be if you are directly behind the blade. Now, if a kickback occurs, it's going to occur directly behind the blade because that's where the spinning force is coming from. So, again, knowing where to stand is very important. Never stand directly behind the blade. You want to be to the right of the blade for rips, to the left of the blade for cross cuts with the miter gauge. Okay? One last thing, you will have to, at some point, make very long rips, even longer than this. If you need to make a long rip, you should have a helper, and you should also have a roller behind to prevent your board from flapping up and down, right? And if you have a helper, your helper is just going to keep it level. They're not going to push, they're not going to pull. They're literally there to help you hold it even with this table. Same thing with if you push it all the way through, right? You make that cut. The person on the other end down there should just be holding that board level, not pushing or pulling, because if that person pull, causes that cut to rotate sideways, it's going to kick back or break or burn your material, okay? So it's very important if you are a helper to just hold, all right? And last thing, you never cut freehand with this machine. If you try to come up here with no fence and no miter gauge and try to cut through this machine, it's very likely that it's not going to, number one, be straight, and number two, you're really asking for a kickback because that blade, the kerf of that blade, right, 1/8 of an inch, if you try to twist it in that, you're going to, or you try to adjust your cut, you're going to cause a tremendous amount of friction, and friction is how you get that kickback. All right, so for the last thing, I'm going to cut this at an angle to show you how that works. So we would set this up. I'm going to remove my miter gauge, and I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to set my blade. You can see the whole thing start to tilt. We'll say I'll set this to 30 degrees. So if I wanted to rip cut along a 30-degree angle, I would set it like this. I'm going to place my board in there, take a look, and this is really going to rip this almost in half. Now, I don't have a real measurement here, so I don't know, exactly how it is, but just eyeballing it, right, it looks like almost in half. And I'm going to use a push stick this time. So whenever you use a push stick, you start up the machine. You're just going to keep, with your left hand, you're going to keep pressure here. You're never applying pressure next to the blade on this side over here. You're just behind the blade. And any pressure you're pushing against the fence behind the blade is completely fine. So I'll start it. You can use a push stick here or whenever you get all the way. It doesn't matter, whatever you feel more comfortable. As long as this isn't lifting up, you're good. All right, so I'll set that there. I'll push it through. My guard's grabbing it right here, so I'm just going to adjust. I'll grab my push stick here. And turn it off. All right, so notice I have that piece just sitting there. You don't want to touch it until that's done spinning, because if you bump it into the blade, that's how you get that kickback. All right, so let me take a look on this side. All right? It did cut it at a 30-degree angle. This side, it did as well. There you go, you can see, right? So, a couple examples of how to use the table saw. It is, I would say, the most dangerous tool in the room, but it's the most versatile, and we use it probably the most out of any. So you just want to be aware how to use this machine and how to use it well.